Imagine a Tyrannosaurus rex. Like, just picture this massive apex predator. And now imagine a tiny, shrew-like mammal, maybe the size of your thumb, right? Trembling in the mud beneath some rotting fern.
Yeah, the classic David and Goliath visual.
Exactly. And for, I mean, over 150 million years, that power dynamic was just locked in stone. The giant reptiles owned the sunlight, and our mammalian ancestors just scurried around in the shadows.
Waiting for their moment, essentially.
Right. But then, 66 million years ago, in the span of just a single chaotic afternoon, the rules of the game flipped entirely. A rock the size of a city hit the planet, and the undisputed rulers of the Earth were wiped out, paving the way for that little shrew to, eventually evolve into us.
It's incredible to think about, but the tendency is always to focus on the apocalyptic scale of it all. The sheer volume of death is mesmerizing. I mean, estimates suggest 75% or more of all species on the planet just simply vanished.
Which is an unfathomable number.
It is. But when you only stare at the destruction, you miss the mechanics. To understand the biodiversity of the world you and I inhabit right now, we have to understand the incredibly specific filters this catastrophic event imposed on life.
The filters.
Right. It wasn't just a random lottery where 3/4 of life just drew a bad hand. The extinction had rules, strict, terrifying rules based on diet, size, and geography.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are looking at the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, commonly known as the KPG event. We're diving into the geological records, the fossil evidence, the climate modeling.
For all of it.
Yeah, to figure out the intricate, surprising mechanisms of why certain creatures survived while others perished. We want to know how the planet reacted and how the literal ashes of the Mesozoic era set the stage for the modern world. So to understand the aftermath, we really have to start with the rock itself, the Chicxulub impact.
Right, and the foundation of our modern understanding of this event actually starts in 1980. And what's interesting is it didn't start with a dinosaur bone.
Oh, really?
No, it started with a geological anomaly, the Alvarez hypothesis. You had Luis Alvarez, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, and his son, Walter, who was a geologist.
Oh, father-son team. That's cool.
Yeah. So Walter was studying a specific layer of limestone in Italy that marked the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods. And he noticed this thin layer of clay right at the boundary where the microfossils just abruptly changed.
Like they just vanished.
Exactly. So he wanted to know how long it took for that thin layer of clay to form.
Right, because if you're a geologist in the 1970s, you're operating under the assumption of uniformitarianism, which is, the idea that Earth changes slowly, gradually over millions of years.
Right.
You aren't looking for a sudden apocalypse. You're just trying to measure the slow accumulation of dust.
Precisely the opposite of a sudden catastrophe. So Walter asked his father, Luis, for help figuring out a way to time the deposition of this clay. Luis suggested looking at the concentration of meteoritic dust.
Does space dust falls to Earth at a constant rate, right?
Exactly. Space dust falls at a relatively constant rate. So if you measure the amount of certain rare elements in the clay, you might be able to calculate how long it took to accumulate. They decided to look for an element called iridium, working with chemists Frank Asaro and Helen Michel.
And iridium is not something you just find in your backyard dirt.
No, not at all. It is exceptionally rare in the Earth's crust. It's what we call a siderophile element, meaning it's iron-loving.
Iron-loving, okay.
Yeah, so billions of years ago, when the Earth was still molten during its planetary differentiation phase, heavy elements like iron sank to the center of the planet to form the core. Because iridium loves iron, almost all of Earth's native iridium was dragged down into the core with it.
Oh, wow. So it's basically locked away in the center of the Earth.
Exactly. So the surface of our planet is virtually devoid of it.
But asteroids and comets, which never went through that kind of planetary melting and sorting, they're still full of it.
Yes.
So if you're digging in the dirt in Italy and you suddenly find a spike in iridium, that's a massive red flag.
A huge red flag.
Yeah.
And the spike they found was staggering. They were expecting tiny background levels. Instead, they found an anomaly where iridium was concentrated at levels up to 160 times higher than the surrounding rock.
160 times? That's insane.
And it wasn't just in Italy. They tested boundary clay from Denmark, from New Zealand. The iridium anomaly was global.
Wow.
So that led the Alvarez team to propose a radical, highly controversial hypothesis for 1980. They said an asteroid, roughly 10 kilometers wide, had hit the Earth and caused the mass extinction.
I can only imagine how the established geological community reacted to a physicist walking into their field and claiming a giant space rock killed the dinosaurs.
Oh, the pushback was intense. Paleontologists at the time were largely convinced the dinosaurs died out gradually due to climate changes or volcanic activity. The idea of a sudden cosmic catastrophe felt like a step backward into mythology.
Like catastrophism all over again.
Right. But the physical evidence just kept compounding. Other researchers started finding shocked quartz at the boundary layer.
Shocked quartz, what does that mean exactly?
Well, quartz is a very tough mineral. But under the immense explosive pressures of an impact, its internal crystalline structure actually fractures in a very specific cross-hatched pattern. You don't get shocked quartz from regular volcanic eruptions.
Where do you get it then?
You only get it from nuclear bomb test sites and meteor craters.
Wow. Okay, so that's pretty definitive. And they also started finding microtectites, right? These tiny, perfectly spherical beads of glass, which is basically what happens when you melt a billion tons of rock, blast it into the stratosphere, and it cools into little glass marbles as it falls back down.
Exactly. So the evidence of a global shower of space debris is everywhere. But for a whole decade, nobody could find the hole in the ground.
Right. If a 10-kilometer rock hits the planet, it should leave a pretty massive mark.
The hunt for the crater was one of the great scientific detective stories of the late 20th century. The breakthrough came when researchers started looking at geophysical surveys conducted in 1978 by Pemex, the Mexican state oil company.
So they were just looking for oil.
Yeah, they had been mapping the Yucatan Peninsula, looking for oil, and found this massive semicircular gravitational and magnetic anomaly buried deep underground. By the early 1990s, the geological smoking gun was confirmed, the Chicxulub crater.
The scale of this thing is just almost impossible to hold in your head. It's an oval scar buried under Mexico that averages roughly 180 kilometers across, over 100 miles wide.
It's massive.
And the asteroid that caused it is estimated to have been between 10 and 15 kilometers wide. That is Mount Everest falling out of the sky at 20 kilometers a second.
The transfer of kinetic energy is difficult to fathom. The impact released energy equivalent to 100 teratons of TNT.
100 teratons.
Yeah, that is over 1 billion times the energy of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. When a body that massive hits the Earth's crust at that speed, the crust doesn't behave like solid rock, it behaves like a fluid.
Like dropping a pebble in a pond, but the pond is made of granite.
Basically, yes. The rock is instantaneously vaporized, melted, and thrown outward, while the ground at ground zero compresses violently downward before rebounding upward, creating what's called a peak ring.
And we know exactly what happened down there because in 2016, there was a major drilling project. They took a rig out into the Gulf of Mexico and drilled straight down into the submerged peak ring of the Chicxulub crater to see the literal bedrock of the apocalypse.
Yes, the core samples from that expedition were revelatory. They pulled up granite that had originated deep within the Earth's crust. This granite had been shattered, subjected to unimaginable pressure, and then thrust upward to the surface in a matter of minutes.
Minutes? That's terrifying.
But from a biological standpoint, the most critical finding from the 2016 drilling project wasn't what they found in the core, it was what was completely missing.
Right, the gypsum.
Exactly. The surrounding shallow seabed of the Yucatan is packed with evaporate minerals, specifically gypsum, which is a sulfate-rich rock. But inside the crater's peak ring, there was hardly any to be found.
Where'd it go?
The sheer force and heat of the impact had completely vaporized the gypsum.
I have to stop here and look at the geometry of this disaster because it feels absurdly unlucky. It's like throwing a dart at a dartboard. But the dartboard is a planetary-scale chemical refinery.
That's an excellent way to put it.
Hitting the Yucatan Peninsula, hitting a shallow sea, absolutely packed with combustible hydrocarbons and sulfate-rich gypsum, might have been the single worst place on the surface of the Earth for this asteroid to land.
It really was.
Like, if it had hit the deep Pacific Ocean, it would have been a massive tsunami event, sure, but it wouldn't have turned the bedrock itself into atmospheric poison.
The trajectory and the target were the ultimate worst-case scenario. If it hits deep water, you don't get the sulfur. If it hits solid continental shield rock, you get dust, but far less of the climate-altering aerosols.
But it hit the gypsum.
Yes. The impactor was large enough to penetrate the crust and eject deep granite, but it was the vaporization of that specific sulfate-rich surface geology that sealed the fate of the dinosaurs. The impact instantly injected hundreds of billions of tons of sulfur directly into the stratosphere.
We'll get to what that sulfur did to the sky in a minute, but the immediate physical shockwave on the ground is just as wild. The kinetic energy displaced the shallow sea and the Earth's crust so violently that it generated mega tsunamis. We're not talking about a big wave at the beach here.
No, no. The models surrounding these megatsunamis push the boundaries of hydrodynamics. In the deep ocean, estimations suggest these waves would have reached 4.6 kilometers from trough to peak.
Wait, 4.6 kilometers? That is almost 3 miles high.
Yes, as these waves approached the continental shelves, they would have slowed down but steepened, creating walls of water that scoured the coastlines of the globe.
And the geological record shows the scars of this water movement, right? Like inside the Chicxulub crater itself, there is a graded sand deposit around 100 meters thick. That is a 300-foot thick layer of sand dumped in a single geological instant by the chaotic waters rushing back into the steaming hole in the crust.
The Gulf of Mexico essentially behaved like a bathtub being violently shaken.
Mm-hmm.
The water sloshed back and forth repeatedly in a phenomenon known as a seiche.
A seiche wave.
Right. And in various parts of the Americas, we find fossiliferous sedimentary rocks from this exact boundary bearing massive tsunami wash deposits. These layers are filled with the remains of mangrove-type ecosystems, ripped up by the roots, pulverized, and redeposited miles inland or dragged out into the deep ocean.
There's a really chilling detail about those shallow tsunami deposits. Researchers have found fossilized fish mixed into the sediment, seemingly killed by the sheer physical trauma of the waves. But the bodies of those fish weren't disturbed by scavengers. Usually a dead fish on a beach is gone in an hour.
True.
These fish just rotted in the mud because there were no scavengers left to eat them.
Because the regional devastation across the Americas would have been absolute. The physical shock wave, the thermal blast, and the subsequent tsunamis erased everything within a radius of a few thousand kilometers almost instantly.
But a regional disaster, even one this spectacular, does not cause a global mass extinction. I mean, a dinosaur in what is now Mongolia wouldn't have been killed by a tsunami in the Gulf of Mexico.
Exactly. The mechanism that made this a worldwide biological filter was what happened when the sky went dark.
The global aftermath. The sequence of atmospheric horrors. Let's walk through the timeline, starting from the exact moment the rock hits.
So the first phase of the global kill mechanism began just minutes to hours after the impact. The colossal amount of rock that was vaporized and blasted into space didn't stay in space.
Right. What goes up must come down.
It cooled into those tiny glass microtectites we mentioned earlier, and then Earth's gravity pulled them back down. As billions of tons of this material re-entered the atmosphere, the friction generated immense heat.
It's like billions of shooting stars happening simultaneously across the entire sky.
Exactly. And the collective friction of that re-entry created a brief, intense pulse of thermal radiation. For hours, the sky essentially acted like an oven broiler.
Like an oven broiler, just baking the surface.
Yes. The temperature of the atmosphere spiked, and the heat radiating downward would have been enough to cook living tissue and ignite dry vegetation. Any organism exposed on the surface, unable to dive underwater or retreat deep into a burrow, would have suffered fatal burns.
But the research points to a massive debate about what happened next. The Cretaceous-Paleogene firestorm debate. Did the whole world actually catch on fire?
What's fascinating here is the division among researchers over the scale and intensity of those fires. Some early models suggested that the thermal radiation was intense enough to ignite the entire terrestrial biosphere simultaneously.
Wow.
Imagine global firestorms consuming every forest on Earth, pumping unthinkable amounts of soot into the atmosphere. However, other physicists and paleontologists argue that the lower atmosphere and the initial waves of falling ejecta would have actually absorbed much of that thermal radiation.
Oh, like a shield.
Right, shielding the surface from the absolute worst of it.
So the whole planet didn't necessarily burn down.
The current consensus leans away from a single, uniform global inferno. The ferocious fires were likely massive but regional, perhaps limited to North and South America and parts of Europe, depending on the trajectory of the ejecta plume.
That makes sense.
But frankly, whether the fires were global or merely continent-sized, the sheer volume of soot from whatever did burn was catastrophic.
Because that soot joins the pulverized silicate dust from the crater, and more importantly, it joins the hundreds of billions of tons of vaporized sulfur from the gypsum. And together, they form a canopy. The sun just turns off.
The atmospheric cocktail blocked out the sun, plunging the Earth into a period of profound darkness and cold known as an impact winter. The fine silicate dust alone could have sustained a deep chill, but the sulfuric acid aerosols are what drove the climate over the edge.
Because sulfur reflects sunlight, right?
Yes, sulfur aerosols are highly reflective. They bounce incoming solar radiation back into space. Sunlight reaching the Earth's surface was reduced by more than 50% globally.
Wow.
And in some models, it was blocked almost entirely, making it too dark for plants to photosynthesize for up to a year or more.
And if the plants can't photosynthesize, the thermostat of the planet just breaks. The temperature drops mentioned in the climate models are staggering. Sea surface temperatures plummeting by as much as 7 degrees Celsius.
The freezing temperatures of this impact winter likely persisted for at least 3 years, with the global darkness lasting perhaps upwards of 2 years. If we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo.
Oh, yeah, in the Philippines.
Right. That eruption pumped enough sulfur into the stratosphere to observably cool the entire planet by about half a degree Celsius for a couple of years. The climatic forcing of the Chicxulub event was roughly 100 times more potent than Pinatubo.
And just to add insult to injury, the sky isn't just dark and cold, it's toxic. Those sulfur aerosols eventually have to come down, and they react with water vapor in the atmosphere to create massive amounts of sulfuric acid rain.
The acid rain would have been intense and prolonged. While the buffering capacity of the soil might have mitigated some of the damage on land, the acid rain falling into the oceans was devastating. It rapidly acidified the surface waters, fundamentally altering the chemistry of the marine environment.
Okay, let's just pause and summarize the reality on the ground for a second. The sky rains molten glass, the air acts like a broiler, then the sun turns off for 2 years, temperatures plummet below freezing, and sulfuric acid rains down on you in the dark.
It's grim.
Yeah. How does anything survive that?
That is the pivotal question of the KPG boundary. Because life did survive, but the biosphere that crawled out of the darkness was vastly fundamentally different from the one that existed the day before.
Right.
The event was global and rapid, but it was not indiscriminate. The environmental nightmare you just described created a very specific, unforgiving set of biological filters.
And this brings us to the rules of survival. The headline is always, the dinosaurs died, but it's much more surgical than that. The KPG event wiped out almost all tetrapods weighing more than 25 kilograms, or about 55 pounds.
A very hard cutoff.
Yeah, if you were bigger than a medium-sized dog, you were gone. All the non-avian dinosaurs, the pterosaurs in the sky, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs in the ocean, they all vanished. Yet, early mammals, certain birds, crocodilians, and turtles made it. Why do the crocodiles live when the T-Rex dies?
To understand why, we have to look deeply at physiology and ecological niches. Let's start with the dinosaurs. There's a strong growing consensus in paleontology that most dinosaurs were endothermic or warm-blooded, or at least had very high metabolic rates compared to modern reptiles.
Okay.
Endotherms require a vast continuous supply of calories simply to fuel their internal furnaces.
You have to keep stoking the fire. Like, an elephant spends most of its waking hours just eating leaves to keep its massive warm-blooded body functioning.
Exactly. When the sun went out and photosynthesis halted, the base of the terrestrial food chain collapsed. The plants died back to their roots or seeds.
So the food just vanished overnight.
Yes. The large herbivorous dinosaurs, requiring hundreds of pounds of fodder a day, starved almost immediately. And when the herbivores collapsed, the massive carnivorous dinosaurs that preyed upon them followed rapidly. A large endotherm simply cannot endure months, let alone years, of severe food scarcity in a freezing environment.
But then you look at the crocodilians. They are ectothermic, cold-blooded. Their body temperature is regulated by the environment, which means their resting metabolic rate is incredibly low.
Ectothermy was a massive advantage during the impact winter. A large modern crocodilian can survive for a year without eating if it absolutely has to, just by slowing its metabolism down to a crawl.
A whole year without eating. Wow.
Furthermore, their reproductive strategy helped. Crocodilians lay eggs and their young hatch, very small. Those tiny juveniles grow slowly and feed on small invertebrates, amphibians, and dead organisms. They didn't need to hunt large prey to survive the critical first few years of the darkness.
So a low metabolism buys you time, but you still have to eat something eventually, and the data shows that diet was perhaps the ultimate filter. Neither strictly herbivorous nor strictly carnivorous mammals seem to have survived.
Yes, specialization was deadly.
Right. If you only ate fresh leaves, or you only ate live prey, you died. The mammals and birds that made it through were generally omnivores, insectivores, and carrion eaters.
It was an ecosystem entirely devoid of primary productivity. The survivors were those who could exploit the decay.
I think of the post-impact food web like a post-apocalyptic economy.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, photosynthesis is the global central bank that funds everything. When the sky goes dark, the bank goes totally bankrupt. The only currency left in circulation is garbage, detritus, dead leaves, rotting wood, and the decaying bodies of the animals that starved.
That's a great analogy.
Right. If you were a scavenger, a shrew eating worms and snails, or a small bird picking at insects feeding on dead wood, you were suddenly wealthy. Your food source actually increased temporarily. But if you were a specialized predator relying on hunting large, living prey, you were broke and you starved.
That garbage economy analogy holds up perfectly. And it explains one of the most fascinating anomalies in the survival record: the stark difference between freshwater and marine environments.
Oh, yeah.
In the open ocean, the giant apex predators, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, went completely globally extinct. But in rivers, streams, and lakes, large semi-aquatic predators actually survived.
That always blew my mind. We established that being big is a death sentence, yet alongside the crocodilians, you have groups like the choristers surviving.
Yes, exactly.
These were gharial-like semi-aquatic reptiles. The source data mentions one genus, Champsosaurus, which was a large predatory reptile that made it right through the boundary unscathed. Why does a giant reptile in a river live while a giant reptile in the ocean dies? If the world is freezing and covered in ash, wouldn't the rivers just fill with toxic mud?
It comes down to how the foundational energy of those specific ecosystems is structured. The open marine ecosystem is heavily, almost exclusively, dependent on primary production from living, photosynthetic phytoplankton.
So they need the sun directly.
Yes. When the sun vanished and the ocean surface acidified, that planktonic food web shattered instantly. Without plankton, the small fish die. Without small fish, the big fish die. Without the big fish, the mosasaurs starve. It's a rapid vertical collapse.
But the rivers work differently.
Right. Stream and lake ecosystems are fundamentally different. They rely much less on living aquatic plants for their base energy. They're inherently detritus-based ecosystems.
Back to the garbage economy.
Exactly. Think about a forest stream. It runs on organic matter washing in from the land, dead leaves falling from trees, soil runoff, ground insects. The freshwater environments were naturally buffered against the immediate collapse of photosynthesis because their baseline energy source was already the garbage from the surrounding landscape.
So when the terrestrial forests died and started rotting, a massive influx of dead organic matter washed into the rivers. The base of the freshwater food chain actually got a massive caloric injection while the ocean's food chain was completely severed.
Precisely. The freshwater food webs remained intact long enough for the cold-blooded predators within them to wait out the darkness. But you mentioned the ocean's food chain being severed. That marine microapocalypse is perhaps one of the most stark examples of how the impact reorganized life on a microscopic level.
The scale of the collapse in the oceans is terrifying. The research indicates that the oceans may have returned to a single-celled state unseen in over 500 million years.
It was a massive reset.
Yeah, the primary producers, the photosynthetic plankton, were just utterly devastated by the lack of sunlight and the sudden acidification of the surface waters.
The specific victims and survivors among the plankton tell an amazing evolutionary story. Take the coccolithophores. These are single-celled algae that build exquisite microscopic chalk shells around themselves.
Like the White Cliffs of Dover, right? That's made of them.
Yes, exactly. They were incredibly abundant and vital to the open ocean ecosystem in the late Cretaceous. At the KPG boundary, they were nearly eradicated.
But a few species of coccolithophores did survive, and researchers discovered they shared a very specific, almost science fiction-like trait: mixotrophy.
It's a brilliant survival mechanism. Mixotrophy means an organism can utilize different sources of energy or carbon. Researchers theorize that the surviving coccolithophore species weren't just passively floating and photosynthesizing.
They could actually do more than just soak up sun.
Yes, they possess flagella, meaning they were capable of movement and they could actually ingest prey particles.
So when the sun went out and their solar panels stopped working, these microscopic plants essentially became microscopic hunters.
Exactly.
They switched from being photosynthetic to eating the bacteria and organic debris floating in the dark water.
They leveraged their biological versatility. When the skies eventually cleared and sunlight returned to the oceans, these mixotrophic survivors were the ones who repopulated the surface waters, eventually abandoning their hunting behavior and returning to pure photosynthesis. They were critical to restoring the algal food web over time.
That microscopic collapse cascades upward into the larger invertebrates, too. The reef builders were decimated. You read about the rudis bivalves, these massive cone-shaped clams that form huge reef structures in the Cretaceous oceans. They went completely extinct.
Yes, completely gone.
And colonial corals suffered a 98% extinction rate at the genus level. Basically, the reefs died.
If we look at modern ecology, it explains exactly why this happened. Colonial corals, both then and now, rely on a symbiotic relationship with photosynthetic zooxanthellae algae that live inside their tissues.
Right, they share nutrients.
It's a mutualistic partnership. But no sunlight means the algae die, which means the corals bleach and starve. A 98% loss of colonial corals shows just how total the darkness was.
But solitary corals did fine.
Relatively speaking, yes. Solitary corals generally don't form reefs. They live in colder or deeper waters below the photic zone.
The photic zone being the area where sunlight reaches.
Exactly. Because they live in the dark naturally, they don't rely on symbiotic algae. They catch falling detritus and zooplankton with their tentacles. They were already adapted to a dark, cold environment where food falls from above as marine snow. The impact winter was just business as usual for them.
This brings me to what might be my absolute favorite detail from the biological data, the tale of two shells.
Oh, yes.
The ammonites versus the nautiloids. If you've ever stepped into a natural history museum or a rock shop, you know the ammonites. They are those beautiful, spiraled, highly diverse shelled cephalopods.
Very iconic fossils.
Yeah, and they were incredibly successful. They were everywhere in the Cretaceous oceans, and they went 100% extinct. Not a single species survived. Meanwhile, their evolutionary cousins, the nautiloids, represented today by the chambered nautilus, survived.
It is a remarkable divergence.
You look at their fossils, and you look at a nautilus today, and they are both squid-like creatures living inside spiral shells. Why did one spiral shell inherit the ocean while the other was wiped from existence?
The answer doesn't lie in their adult forms, but in their reproductive strategies. It comes down to how and where they raise their young. Ammonoids utilized what is known as a planktonic reproductive strategy.
Planktonic, so floating.
Yes, they laid numerous tiny eggs that hatched into microscopic planktonic larvae. These larvae floated in the upper water column, relying on the ocean currents to disperse them and feeding on the abundant phytoplankton.
But the upper water column is exactly where the apocalypse was happening. The surface waters were the most devastated part of the ocean. It was acidified by the sulfuric rain, the temperatures had plummeted, and the phytoplankton they relied on for food were dead.
It was a death trap.
Yeah, the ammonite young simply hatched into a toxic, freezing, starving environment. Furthermore, their tiny shells were made of aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate that is highly susceptible to dissolving in acidic water.
Their entire reproductive cycle was tied to the most vulnerable zone of the planet. But the nautiloids relied on a fundamentally different strategy. They did not produce thousands of floating larvae. Instead, nautiloids laid a small number of relatively large eggs, and crucially, they laid them deep on the seafloor.
They bypassed the kill zone entirely.
Precisely. By laying large eggs in the deep benthic zones, the nautiloid young were buffered from the worst of the temperature swings and the surface acidification.
That's incredible.
Furthermore, because the eggs were larger, the young hatched at a larger size, capable of foraging immediately. And what do they forage on? The detritus and dead organic matter raining down from the slaughter occurring in the surface waters above.
It's staggering. A biological lineage that had thrived for hundreds of millions of years was completely erased, while a similar lineage survived, all because of a simple difference in where they chose to place their eggs.
It really highlights the fine line between survival and extinction.
Absolutely. Having seen how the base of the food web determined everything in the water, I want to pivot back to dry land. The same lack of sunlight that starved the plankton in the ocean was simultaneously freezing the roots of the terrestrial forests. Let's look at what that darkness did to the plants.
The devastation of terrestrial plant communities was profound and immediate. Fossilized pollen and leaves tell a very clear story of massive global disruption. In North America, the palynological data, the pollen record, suggests that approximately 57% of plant species became completely extinct.
57%. Just gone.
The impact winter halted photosynthesis. The freezing temperatures destroyed foliage, and the acid rain damaged the soil. The immediate aftermath on land, while the sky was still dark and choked with aerosols, was defined almost entirely by decay.
The forest of the Cretaceous was gone. replaced by millions of square miles of rotting wood and dying vegetation. And wherever there is massive decay on that scale, the fungi take over.
The microfossil record paints a vivid picture of this. Right at the KPG boundary layer, there's a massive abrupt spike in fungal spores, such as monoporous sporites.
Monoporous spores.
Yes. Due to the wholesale destruction of living plants, the Earth briefly became a paradise for saprotrophic organisms. These are fungi that do not require sunlight at all. They feed entirely on decomposing organic matter.
So they were just feasting.
For a few short years, while the atmosphere was choked with dust and sulfur, the dominant form of life on the land masses wasn't a dinosaur or a mammal. It was mold and mushrooms.
It's such a bleak, alien image. A freezing, dark world covered in fungal blooms feeding on the ruins of the Mesozoic. But eventually, the atmosphere has to clear. The sulfates wash out as acid rain, the silicate dust settles, and for the first time in years, the sun actually hits the soil again.
Light finally returns.
But when the light returns, a forest doesn't just instantly spring back up. The geological record shows something called a fern spike.
Yes, the fern spike is a classic signature of the recovery phase. In the rock layers immediately above the fungal boundary, the spore and pollen record is utterly dominated by fern spores, with very little angiosperm or flowering plant pollen present.
Why ferns?
Because ferns are the ultimate pioneer species. They reproduce via spores, which are incredibly hardy and can disperse over vast distances on the wind. More importantly, ferns thrive in disturbed, barren environments.
Oh, like after a forest fire.
Exactly. We observed the exact same pattern of recolonization in modern times after the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. The landscape was scorched and buried in ash, and the first things to aggressively recolonize the blasted earth were ferns. For perhaps centuries after the Chicxulub impact, just a few species of fern appear to have dominated vast continental landscapes, stabilizing the soil before larger angiosperm plants slowly returned.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. The plants slowly start coming back. The forests eventually begin to regrow in the Paleocene, but the insects taking a bite out of those plants, that's a vastly different story.
The insect record is fascinating.
Right. Researchers didn't just look at fossilized leaves to see what plants survived. They looked at the damage on those leaves to see what was eating them. And they found that even long after the plants were recovering, insect diversity had plummeted and stayed incredibly low. Even 1.7 million years after the asteroid hit, there was very little predation from insects.
It highlights how delicate the specific associations between plants and insects are. Many insect species are highly specialized, feeding only on a single type of plant.
So if their host plant dies, they die.
Exactly. When 57% of the plants go extinct, the insects that rely on them vanish as well. It takes millions of years for new specialized relationships to evolve. But what is truly remarkable in the insect record isn't just the loss of diversity. It was a physical shrinking of the survivors. We see clear evidence of the Lilliput effect in terrestrial invertebrates.
Wait, let me work this out. If the environment is a wasteland and food is incredibly scarce, I would intuitively assume animals would need to travel much longer distances to find a meal. Usually, covering long distances efficiently favors larger bodies with longer strides. But the fossil record shows the exact opposite happening, right? Things got smaller.
It's an incredibly logical assumption, but it completely breaks down into the sheer severity of this specific environment. What we actually see is the Lilliput effect, named after the island of tiny people in Jonathan Swift's novel.
Oh, Gulliver's Travels.
Yes. It's a phenomenon often observed in the immediate aftermath of mass extinctions, where the surviving taxa are drastically smaller in physical size than their pre-extinction ancestors.
How small are we talking?
Very noticeable reductions. For example, studies on trace fossils, specifically the burrows made by soil-dwelling insects like cicada nymphs or beetle larvae, known as the Ichnotaxon Nactodamus bony show, a significant widespread decrease in burrow diameter across the KPG transition.
Why does shrinking help you survive the apocalypse?
It comes down to absolute resource requirements. While a larger animal might be able to travel further, it requires a massive caloric baseline just to stay alive. A smaller animal needs exponentially fewer calories and less oxygen, and it can reproduce much faster.
It's all about efficiency.
Right. The extreme environmental stress, the lack of high-quality food, and the wildly altered climate heavily favored organisms that could mature quickly and survive on mere scraps. Evolution aggressively selected for miniaturization.
So the animals that survived had to shrink and eat garbage. But what about the plants that made it? How did the surviving angiosperms, the flowering plants, pull it off? The research mentions a genetic trait called polyploidy as a major survival mechanism. Explain polyploidy to me because it sounds like a genetic superpower.
It effectively is a genetic superpower during a crisis. Polyploidy is a condition where an organism has multiple copies of its entire genome within its cells.
Multiple copies, like how many?
Well, most animals, including humans, are diploid. We have two sets of chromosomes, one from each parent. But many plants are polyploid, possessing 4, 6, or even 8 sets.
So they have backup copies of their DNA.
That's an excellent way to think about it. They have redundant genetic toolkits. The fossil and genetic evidence suggests that plant lineages with polyploidy had a significantly enhanced ability to survive the extinction event.
How does having a backup hard drive of DNA help you survive a freezing dark winter?
Because of how it allows for rapid mutation without fatal consequences. If you only have one copy of a critical gene and it mutates poorly due to environmental stress, you die.
Game over.
Exactly. But if you have 4 copies, one copy can continue performing the essential function needed for basic survival, while the redundant copies are free to mutate and experiment.
Oh, wow.
This allows polyploid plants to adapt to wildly fluctuating environmental conditions much faster than diploid plants. And the environment post-impact was wildly fluctuating. They didn't just have to survive the freezing impact winter, they had to survive the rapid global warming that followed it.
Right, because once the aerosols dissipated and the sun came back, the massive amounts of carbon dioxide released by the vaporized carbonate rocks at the Chicxulub site trapped the sun's heat. So the Earth went from a firestorm to a deep freeze to a suffocating greenhouse.
It was whiplash.
Now, up to this point, our entire discussion has laid the blame for this chaos squarely on the asteroid. It's the smoking gun. But when you look closely at the broader geological record, there's a massive plot twist. The Earth might have already been very, very sick before the rock even arrived.
This is perhaps one of the most vigorously debated areas in modern paleontology. The asteroid is undeniable, but it might not have acted alone. To understand the full context of the extinction, we have to look halfway across the world from Mexico to India, specifically to a massive igneous province known as the Deccan Traps.
When we talk about volcanoes, most people picture Mount St. Helens or Vesuvius, a single mountain blowing its top. The Deccan Traps were not that. This was flood basalt volcanism.
It is volcanism on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. The Deccan Traps were created by a massive mantle plume tearing through the Earth's crust, releasing staggering volumes of highly fluid lava. This wasn't an eruption, it was a continent-sized leakage.
Just a tear in the planet.
The lava flows cover roughly 500,000 square kilometers of India today, and in some places, those layers of solid basalt are 2 kilometers thick.
And the timing of this geological nightmare is what makes it so suspicious.
Exactly. The most recent high-precision radiometric dating shows that these massive eruptions occurred over a period of roughly 800,000 years, perfectly spanning the KPG boundary. They started before the asteroid hit and continued long after.
And as we've established, volcanoes don't just release lava. The lava itself only destroys what it touches. The real danger is what the volcanoes pump into the atmosphere, the outgassing.
The volcanic outgassing from the Deccan Traps altered the global atmosphere significantly. They released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. Plant fossils from that era show a decrease in the density of stomata on their leaves, the pores they use to breathe, which is a direct biological response to a highly enriched CO2 atmosphere.
So the plants were physically reacting to it.
Calculations suggest a 250 part per million increase in CO2 concentrations directly attributable to this volcanic activity.
Which acts as a massive greenhouse gas.
The data indicates this outgassing caused global temperatures to rise rapidly by 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in the hundreds of thousands of years leading up to the impact. But it wasn't just warming. The volcanic activity also continuously pumped out sulfur dioxide, causing regional acid rain and released heavy metals.
Heavy metals, too.
We see clear evidence of increased mercury deposition in the geologic record from this exact time period, causing toxic stress to ecosystems globally.
So, just to set the stage, before the asteroid even enters the atmosphere, you have a planet suffering from severe global warming, chronic acid rain, and creeping mercury poisoning. And on top of all of that, the geological record shows there is a severe drop in sea levels happening globally at the exact same time, a marine regression.
Yes, the marine regression is the third prong of this pre-impact crisis. There is clear evidence that sea levels fell dramatically in the final stage of the Maastrichtian, the very end of the Cretaceous by, more than at any other time in the Mesozoic era.
What causes the oceans to just drain away like that?
It was likely driven by plate tectonics. The mid-ocean ridges, the massive underwater mountain ranges where new crust is formed, became less active. As they cooled, they became denser and sank lower under their own weight, essentially increasing the volume of the ocean basins.
So the tub got bigger and the water level went down.
Precisely. The water retreated from the continents, draining the massive oceanic seas, like the western interior seaway that formerly split North America in two.
Which destroys millions of square miles of rich, shallow continental shelf habitats. It's a massive loss of coastal real estate for marine life, it fragments terrestrial habitats, and it drastically alters the climate patterns on land. But I have to play devil's advocate here.
Please do.
I can see why paleontologists would look at the volcanoes and the shrinking seas and think maybe the dinosaurs were already dying out and the asteroid just finished them off. But when you look at the 2020 climate models that tried to parse out the effects of the Deccan traps versus Chicxulub, they strongly point to the asteroid as the primary overwhelming driver of the extinction.
The 2020 models are a crucial piece of the puzzle. They simulated the climate effects of the volcanic CO2 and sulfur versus the impact winter. And you are correct, the models show that the sheer, abrupt devastation of the Chicxulub impact winter was the only mechanism severe enough to cause the sudden mass extinction we see in the fossil record.
Okay.
Furthermore, some researchers push back against the volcanic extinction theory by arguing that the long-term warming from the Deccan traps might have actually increased habitat suitability for some species by expanding warm environments into higher latitudes.
Right, so the volcanoes might have actually been helping certain dinosaurs thrive by keeping things warm. It's a messy debate.
It is messy.
Yeah.
But if we synthesize the data, many scientists are leaning toward a multiple causation scenario, often elegantly referred to as the press pulse theory.
Press pulse. I like the sound of that. How does it work? I'm assuming the volcanoes and the sea level regression are the press.
Precisely. The Deccan traps and the shrinking seas act as long-term chronic environmental stressors. They are applying continuous pressure to the biosphere. They are fragmenting habitats, altering ocean currents, shifting global temperatures, and poisoning the air over hundreds of thousands of years.
Constant stress.
This press doesn't necessarily cause a mass extinction on its own, but it weakens ecosystems. It potentially reduced dinosaur diversity and made the global food webs brittle in the final millions of years of the Cretaceous.
And then comes the pulse.
The Chicxulub impact,
Yeah.
the sudden, inescapable, catastrophic blow. An already stressed, brittle biosphere dealing with volcanic greenhouse gases and shrinking seas suddenly faces an afternoon of fire, followed by years of freezing darkness. The combination of chronic stress followed by acute trauma was something the non-avian dinosaurs with their high metabolisms and massive bodies simply couldn't withstand.
Whether it was a single cosmic bullet or a devastating combination of catastrophes, the slate was undeniably wiped clean. But before we fast forward to see what crawled out of the ashes to start the next era, we have to talk about the timing. Because paleontology usually deals in broad eras, millions of years here, millions of years there, but sometimes, very rarely, it captures a single afternoon. How do we know the exact minute-by-minute timing of this ancient event? The research points to an absolutely staggering fossil site in North Dakota called Tanis.
The Tanis site, located within the Hell Creek Formation, is perhaps one of the most uniquely extraordinary discoveries in the history of paleontology. It does not just record the general time period of the extinction, it appears to record the events from the very first minutes until a few hours after the Chicxulub impact in extreme, meticulous, three-dimensional detail.
But wait, help me with the geography here. Chicxulub is in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. Tanis is in North Dakota. That is over 3,000 kilometers away. How does a site in North Dakota record the minute-by-minute details of an impact in Mexico?
Through the physics of water and seismic energy. When the asteroid hit, it generated massive seismic waves that traveled through the Earth's continental crust at speeds of several kilometers per second. These waves would have reached North Dakota in roughly 10 to 15 minutes.
So a massive earthquake rolls into North Dakota.
A sustained, violent earthquake. Now, at that time, Tanis was located on a river valley connected to the receding western interior seaway. When these seismic waves rippled through the bedrock, they triggered a massive, violent sloshing of the standing water in that basin. This is known as a seisha wave.
A seisha wave again?
Yes. It's exactly what happens if you have a swimming pool and you aggressively shake the ground beneath it. The water sloshes violently from side to side.
So it's not a tsunami that traveled across the ocean. It's a massive, localized wave caused by the ground shaking underneath the river.
Exactly. This seismically induced onshore surge created a catastrophic 30-foot-tall flood wave that washed up the river valley, instantly burying everything in its path in a massive deposit of mud and sand.
And what it buried is just a treasure trove.
It entombed a densely packed, chaotic mixture of freshwater sturgeon and paddlefish, marine fish driven inland by the surge, shattered tree trunks, and terrestrial organisms. It buried them instantly and perfectly. But what directly, unequivocally links this localized flood in North Dakota to the asteroid in Mexico are the microtectites.
The little glass impact spheres raining from space?
Yes. The ballistic ejecta from the crater took roughly 45 minutes to fly through space and begin raining down on North Dakota. At Tanis, we find these glass spherules deeply embedded in the sediment. Most astoundingly, they are found trapped in the fossilized gills of the fish.
Wait, so they're swimming, the ground starts shaking, and then literally glass rains into the water and into their gills.
Yeah, precisely. The fish were literally choking on the glass, raining from the sky, at the exact moment the seismic wave buried them alive. We even find the tektites perfectly preserved, suspended in pieces of fossilized amber.
It is a literal high-definition snapshot of doom. But the most astounding part of the Tanis research isn't just the mechanism of death. It's that the isotopic records and the osteological evidence from the fossilized fish bones at this site have allowed scientists to pinpoint the actual season of the impact.
Yes, the seasonal data is a triumph of analytical paleontology. Researchers analyzed the bones of the Acipenseriform fishes, the paddlefishes and sturgeons found at the site. These fish bones grow in layers, depositing different densities of bone tissue depending on the time of year and the abundance of food.
Very much like how you read the growth rings of a tree.
Exactly like tree rings. And by looking at the isotopic chemistry of the outermost ring, the ring that was forming at the exact moment the fish died, they could tell what season it was.
Because the chemical composition changes based on what they eat in spring versus winter.
Right. By cross-referencing the growth lines with fluctuations in carbon isotopes, they determined that the KPG mass extinction happened during the Northern Hemisphere spring.
I want you to really visualize this for a second. It wasn't just a generic, abstract Tuesday in the late Cretaceous. It was springtime. The ecosystems in the Northern Hemisphere were waking up from winter. Flora was budding. The deciduous trees were putting out new leaves. Animals were likely actively breeding and raising young.
A very active time.
Yeah. The paddlefish were swimming up the rivers to spawn. It was the season of highest biological vulnerability. And within hours, it was entombed in a tidal wave of mud and molten glass. Now, I should impart that there is some academic controversy over the Tanis data.
Yes, there is.
Various paleontologists have argued over raw data availability and the interpretation of specific isotopic graphs. But it's crucial to add that the spring dating actually has strong support from multiple independent studies of those fish bones.
Assuming the boreal spring dating holds firm, it adds a poignant layer of tragedy, but also of intense biological significance, to the timing of the event. Ecosystems in spring are operating at maximum energy expenditure. A sudden, catastrophic freeze in the middle of spring is far more devastating to plant and animal populations than one that occurs when they are already dormant.
Knowing exactly when the Mesozoic ended allows us to finally fast forward past the impact winter, past the fungal blooms and the rotting forests, to see the dawn of the next era, the Cenozoic. The asteroid hit, the massive dinosaurs starved, and the world belonged entirely to the survivors. Let's look at the recovery.
The extinction of the dominant Cretaceous groups, particularly the non-avian dinosaurs, provided incredible evolutionary opportunities for the creatures that made it through the bottleneck. The impact essentially emptied vast swaths of ecological niche space globally. What followed in the early Paleocene was a period of explosive adaptive radiation.
An explosion of life.
The survivors, specifically mammals, birds, and teleost fishes, rapidly evolved and diversified into the newly available forms and roles.
Let's talk about the mammals first, because that's our lineage. During the entire reign of the dinosaurs, mammals were generally small, marginal creatures. If you picture a rat or a small badger, you're not far off.
They were ecologically suppressed by the dinosaurs for 150 million years. But that small size, as we discussed, was their salvation during the impact winter. It allowed them to hide in burrows, to require fewer calories, and to subsist on insects and detritus.
And then the sun came out.
Exactly. The moment the skies cleared and the forest began to return, the mammals realized that giant predators and herbivores were gone, and they underwent a radical, unprecedented transformation.
They got big. Fast.
Astonishingly fast in geological terms. The fossil record shows that within about 700,000 years after the extinction event, some mammalian lineages had reached 50 kilograms, or 110 pounds. That is a 100-fold increase over the maximum weight of the mammals that survived the impact. To put that into perspective, morphological diversification rates among eutherians, which are the placental mammals, were 3 times higher immediately after the extinction event than they were at any point before it.
But this explosive growth raises an incredibly interesting question regarding how evolution prioritizes traits. If they grew so big, so incredibly fast, did their brains grow at the same rate? Did they get smarter too?
The fossil skulls from the Paleocene tell a fascinating story that answers that exact question. Recent morphological research highlights a concept of brawn before brains. The evidence shows quite clearly that surviving placental mammals increased their body size first, while their brain sizes remained relatively small.
Why bulk up before you wise up? Why is it more advantageous to be huge and dumb than small and smart?
Because of the immediate ecological pressures. After the impact, there were massive empty ecological niches available for large herbivores and large predators. Being a massive herbivore is an incredibly valuable ecological role, giving you access to abundant plant food with little competition.
And you don't need to be a genius to eat leaves.
Exactly. You don't necessarily need a highly complex, metabolically expensive brain to eat leaves off a bush. You just need a big gut to process the vegetation and a large body to defend your territory. So evolutionary pressure aggressively drove rapid body size increases to snatch up those empty niches as quickly as possible.
Well, it makes a lot of sense.
The relative brain sizes of mammals only began to increase significantly much later during the Eocene epoch once the ecosystems filled up and the competition between these newly large mammals intensified.
Brawn before brains. It makes perfect evolutionary sense. Grab the real estate first, figure out how to outsmart your neighbors later. But mammals weren't the only ones racing to fill the dinosaur-sized void. We have to look at the avian survivors. Because we always say the dinosaurs went extinct, but that's technically false. Birds are dinosaurs. They're the single theropod dinosaur lineage that made it through the filter.
True. But we must remember, it was a remarkably near thing. Only a minute fraction of ground and water-dwelling Cretaceous bird species survived. The skies in the Cretaceous were filled with diverse, archaic bird groups, like the enantornithines, which were toothed birds that dominated the canopy.
Toothed birds?
Yeah. They were completely globally wiped out alongside the pterosaurs. The surviving birds, the ancestors of the neoabies we see today, likely survived for the same reasons the small mammals did. Their ability to dive into the water, swim, or seek shelter in burrows and marshlands, eating seeds and detritus while the forest burned and froze above them.
But once the dust settled and the plants returned, the surviving birds looked around and realized the ground was completely empty. There were no triceratops, there were no ankylosaurs. The massive terrestrial herbivore niches were entirely vacant.
And so, the birds adapted to claim those niches. The sheer open space and the initial scarcity of large predators allowed certain groups, like the ratites, which are the ancestors of today's ostriches, emus, cassowaries, and rheas, to rapidly diversify in the early Paleogene.
And they did it by abandoning the one thing that makes a bird a bird. They grounded themselves.
Exactly. They're believed to have convergently developed flightlessness at least 3 to 6 different times across different continents. Flight is metabolically expensive, and it places strict limits on how large a body can grow.
You can't be an ostrich and fly.
Exactly. By trading the sky for the ground, these birds were able to bulk up immensely, fulfilling the ecological roles for large terrestrial herbivores and omnivores that their non-avian dinosaur cousins had left behind.
It's an incredible full-circle moment in evolutionary history. The giant ruling reptiles fall, and the tiny scurrying mammals and the small ground-dwelling birds inherit the earth, aggressively bulking up to take the crowns left behind by the T-Rex and the Triceratops.
And we see identical patterns of explosive radiation in the oceans once the phytoplankton recovered. Teleost fish, the bony fish, diversified explosively in the empty oceans. Major groups that dominate the seas today, including tunas, billfish, eels, and flatfish, radiate in the Paleocene and Eocene, filling the vast marine predator niches left utterly vacant by the extinction of the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs.
So to bring this all together, let's recap the sheer scale of this incredible journey. We've traced the path of a 10-kilometer rock hurtling through the vacuum of space, slamming into the absolute worst possible place on Earth, the sulfur-rich, shallow coast of Mexico. We've seen the sky turn into a literal broiler, followed by years of a dark, freezing acid bath.
A true apocalypse.
We've witnessed the collapse of the mighty endothermic dinosaurs because they simply require too much food. And we watched the triumph of the cold-blooded crocodilians, the deep-sea nautiloids, and the detritus-eating mammals. The KPG boundary isn't just a millimeter-thick layer of iridium hiding in the rocks of Italy. It is the architectural blueprint for the entire world we live in today.
It absolutely is.
It is the reason mammals run the planet. It's the reason our modern neotropical rainforests, like the Amazon, look the way they do. Because the canopy ecosystems arose entirely from the post-impact recovery. And ultimately, it's the very specific reason you are here today, listening to this, instead of a sentient Trudon.
The contingencies of history are staggering to contemplate. If that asteroid misses by a mere 30 minutes and hits the deep Pacific Ocean instead of the Yucatan, the sulfur is never vaporized, the climate effects are vastly reduced, and the dinosaurs likely survive.
Wow, 30 minutes.
If the Earth wasn't already potentially stressed and fragmented by the Deccan Trap's volcanism, perhaps the biosphere rebounds differently. The modern world is the product of microscopic margins of error.
But I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something we touched on briefly, but which has massive, almost unfair implications when you really sit down and think about it. We talked about how the paddlefish bones at the Tannis site indicate the asteroid hit during the Northern Hemisphere's spring.
Yes, the boreal spring, a time of peak biological vulnerability in the north.
But our planet is tilted on its axis. Spring in the Northern Hemisphere means it is autumn in the Southern Hemisphere.
Right.
Think about what organisms naturally do in the autumn. If plants and animals in the global south were already physiologically preparing for winter dormancy, if the trees were already shedding their leaves, if the animals were naturally slowing their metabolisms, preparing to retreat into burrows or entering states of torpor to wait out the cold, did that mere tilt of the Earth's axis give the Southern Hemisphere a vital, accidental head start on surviving the impact winter?
It is an incredibly compelling hypothesis that is actively being studied. The paleobotanical data actually supports it. Evidence from the Salamanca Formation in Argentina and other southern sites suggests that biotic recovery was indeed much more rapid, and extinction rates in some groups were measurably less severe in the southern hemisphere compared to the decimated north.
It makes you wonder, in the ultimate game of cosmic roulette, could the survival of an entire lineage, the difference between total, devastating extinction and eventually inheriting the Earth, come down to nothing more than what season it happened to be on your side of the world when the sky fell?
It perfectly highlights the ultimate lesson of the KPG boundary. Survival is sometimes less about being the strongest, the fastest, or the most dominant. Sometimes survival is simply about being prepared for the dark.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the KPG event. The next time you look out the window at the birds at your feeder or see a tiny field mouse scurrying in the brush, I hope you look at them with a newfound, profound respect, because you are looking at the ultimate survivors of the darkest hours of the apocalypse.